Paris, July 1789. It is a city on a knife's edge. The summer air is thick with tension. In the sprawling, overcrowded neighborhoods, the smell of unwashed bodies and raw sewage mingles with the scent of baked bread, a scent that has become a source of both obsession and despair. For months, the price of a single loaf of bread, the absolute staple of the common person's diet, has skyrocketed. A family might spend more than half their daily earnings just to keep from starving. Hunger is a constant, gnawing presence. This hunger fuels a simmering anger. Anger at a system that feels ancient and profoundly unfair. French society was rigidly divided into three orders, or estates. The first estate was the clergy. The second was the nobility. Together, they made up a tiny fraction of the population, yet they owned most of the land and paid almost no taxes. Everyone else, from the poorest street sweeper to the wealthiest merchant, was lumped into the third estate. They were over 95% of the population, and they bore the entire financial weight of the nation on their shoulders. For generations, this was simply the way things were. But now, something has changed. New ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of citizens are whispering through the streets, carried in pamphlets, and debated in taverns. This year, for the first time in 175 years, the king, Louis XVI, was forced to call a meeting of the Estates General to address the nation's catastrophic debt. But the hopes for reform quickly soured. The Third Estate, finding themselves locked out and ignored, took a revolutionary step. They declared themselves the true representatives of the people, the National Assembly. They gathered on a royal tennis court and swore an oath not to disband until they had written a new constitution for France. It was a direct challenge to the king's absolute power. Now, in the second week of July, Paris is a powder keg waiting for a spark. The people see soldiers, foreign mercenaries loyal to the king, gathering on the outskirts of the city. They hear rumors that the king plans to dissolve their new assembly by force, to crush this budding revolution before it can fully bloom. Their fear is palpable. Then, on July 12th, the news breaks and spreads like wildfire. The king has dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker, a man seen as the only member of the court who is on the side of the people. To Parisians, this is the final confirmation. The king is making his move. The attack is coming. In the midst of this fear and fury, the eyes of the city turn toward a single, ominous structure that dominates the eastern skyline. It's a medieval fortress, a gloomy, eight-towered behemoth of stone known as the Bastille. For centuries, it has been the king's prison, a symbol of royal tyranny where enemies of the state could be locked away without trial on the king's command alone. On one fateful day, July 14, 1789, the anger of the Parisian people would be unleashed upon this fortress. The attack on the Bastille would become much more than a battle for weapons and gunpowder. It would become the single, explosive event that ignited the French Revolution. In this episode, we will unpack the story of that day. First, we'll explore in more detail the pressures that brought French society to its breaking point. Then, we will walk through the dramatic and chaotic events of July 14th itself, from the hunt for weapons to the bloody siege of the fortress. And finally, we'll examine the immediate aftermath of the Bastille's fall. Part 1. The Powder Keg of Paris. To understand the fury that boiled over on July 14, 1789, we need to look beyond the immediate panic of that week. The storming of the Bastille was not a sudden, isolated squall. It was a hurricane that had been gathering strength for centuries, fueled by deep-seated inequalities, a bankrupt government, and the gnawing hunger of a desperate population. This was the Powder Keg of Paris. And in this part of our story, we will carefully examine the three unstable elements that, when mixed, were destined to explode. A society divided by privilege, an economy crippled by debt, and a people awakened by new political ideas. The foundation of the problem lay in the very structure of French society, an archaic system known as the Ancien Régime, or the Old Regime. For generations, every person in France was born into one of three distinct social orders, or estates. Your birth determined your rights, your opportunities, and your obligations for your entire life. It was a pyramid of privilege, and for the vast majority it was a crushing weight. At the very top sat the first estate, the clergy. The Catholic Church was an immensely powerful institution in France. It owned roughly 10% of all the land in the kingdom, yet it paid virtually no taxes to the state. Instead, it collected its own tax, the tithe, a mandatory 10% levy on the harvests of the peasantry. The church was the keeper of records, the provider of education and charity, and the ultimate moral authority. But the clergy was not a unified body. At its highest levels were archbishops and bishops, often drawn from the ranks of the nobility who lived in magnificent palaces and enjoyed immense wealth. At the bottom were the humble parish priests, men who were often as poor as the peasants they served and who were far more sympathetic to the struggles of the common people. Next on the pyramid was the second estate, the nobility. This group, numbering around 400,000 people, represented less than 2% of the population, but they held a vastly disproportionate amount of wealth and power. They owned about 25% of the land and, like the clergy, were exempt from most of the main taxes. Their privileges were a holdover from the feudal age. They held the exclusive rights to the highest positions in the army, the church, and the government. They could hunt on peasants' land, and they could still collect a host of feudal dues from the people living on their estates. This could include the corvée, a requirement for peasants to perform unpaid labor on the lord's lands or on public works for a set number of days each year. They even had the right to charge peasants for using the lord's mill to grind their grain or his oven to bake their bread. For the nobility, these privileges were a birthright, a fundamental part of their identity that distinguished them from the common rabble. And then there was everyone else, the third estate. This was the single most diverse and sprawling group in France, encompassing over 25 million people. It was, quite simply, everybody who was not a member of the clergy or the nobility. At its top was the bourgeoisie, the middle class. These were the kingdom's doctors, lawyers, merchants, and bankers. Many were wealthier than the provincial nobles who looked down on them. They were often well-educated and had eagerly absorbed the new philosophical ideas of the Enlightenment, ideas that spoke of reason, individual rights, and government by the consent of the governed. They saw a system where their wealth was taxed to prop up a state that gave them no political voice and where their talents were blocked by the unbreakable ceiling of aristocratic privilege. Their resentment was sharp and intellectual. Below them were the urban workers of the towns and cities, a group that would come to be known as the sans-culottes. These were the artisans, shopkeepers, apprentices, and laborers of Paris. Their lives were precarious, dictated by the daily struggle for work and bread. Their anger was rooted in their experience of economic hardship. They were the ones who saw the price of bread double and had to decide which of their children would eat. They were the ones who lived in crowded, unsanitary tenements while looking up at the grand mansions of the aristocracy. Their frustration was visceral and immediate. Finally, forming the massive base of the pyramid were the peasants. They made up more than 80% of the French population. Their lives were a relentless cycle of hard labor, governed by the seasons and a web of obligations. A peasant farmer had to pay taxes to the king, a tithe to the church, and feudal dues to his local lord. When he died, his family often had to pay a tax just to inherit the land he had worked his entire life. This triple burden kept the majority of the French population in a state of perpetual poverty, with no hope for social advancement. For them, the system was a daily, grinding injustice. This deeply unfair structure was the long-term cause of the revolution. It created a nation of simmering resentments, a society where privilege was inherited and poverty was inescapable. But by the 1780s, this broken social system was colliding with a second, more immediate crisis: the near-total collapse of the French economy. The coffers of the kingdom were empty. This financial crisis was the result of decades of lavish spending and costly wars. King Louis XIV, the famous Sun King, had built the magnificent Palace of Versailles, a symbol of royal power that cost a fortune to maintain. His successors, Louis XV and the current king, Louis XVI, continued this tradition of extravagant spending. The court at Versailles was a gilded cage of thousands of nobles, all living off the state's purse in a constant swirl of elaborate ceremonies and entertainments. Compounding this was France's involvement in a series of disastrous and expensive wars throughout the 18th century. The final straw was, ironically, a war that France won, the American Revolution. The French monarchy, eager for any opportunity to strike a blow against its old rival Great Britain, had poured money, troops, and naval power into supporting the American colonists. This support was decisive for American independence, but it pushed the French state over the financial cliff. France essentially went bankrupt, helping to establish a republic based on the very principles of liberty and representative government that were denied to its own people. The heart of the problem was that the monarchy was unable to reform its own tax system. It was a system that was both inefficient and deeply unjust. The main direct tax, the tally, was levied almost exclusively on the peasants of the Third Estate. The wealthiest orders of society, the church and the nobility, who owned most of the nation's land and wealth, were largely exempt. Various finance ministers had tried to introduce reforms. They proposed a land tax that would apply to all three estates, a logical solution to the debt crisis. But their efforts were always blocked by the powerful opposition of the nobility and the clergy, who fiercely guarded their privileges and refused to be taxed. This created a political deadlock. The king was an absolute monarch in theory, but in practice he was too weak to impose his will on the most privileged classes of his own kingdom. By the late 1780s, this long-term financial rot turned into a full-blown emergency for the average person. A series of disastrous weather events, including a severe drought in 1788, followed by one of the coldest winters on record, led to widespread crop failures. The grain harvest plummeted, and as a result, the price of flour, and therefore bread, exploded. In normal times, a Parisian laborer might spend 30 to 50% of his income on bread for his family. By the spring of 1789, that figure had skyrocketed to an unimaginable 80 or even 90%. Hunger turned to desperation, and desperation turned to rage. Bread riots broke out across the country. Bakeries were looted. People accused merchants and wealthy landowners of hoarding grain to drive up prices, and some of these suspected hoarders were lynched by angry mobs. For the people of Paris, the financial crisis was no longer about abstract numbers in a royal ledger, it was about the empty stomachs of their children. The government seemed both powerless and indifferent to their suffering. This economic misery created the volatile, explosive atmosphere in which political sparks could easily start a fire. And those sparks were about to fly. Faced with an empty treasury and the refusal of the privileged orders to accept new taxes, King Louis XVI made a fateful decision. He agreed to convene the Estates General, the old medieval parliament of France, which had not met since the year 1614. This was a monumental concession. It was a tacit admission that the king could no longer govern alone and needed the consent of the nation to levy new taxes. The announcement electrified France. Throughout the kingdom, people gathered to elect their representatives and to compile lists of their grievances, known as the cahiers de doléances. These lists reveal a nation bursting with a desire for change. They called for a fairer tax system, an end to feudal dues, and a written constitution to limit the power of the monarchy. For the first time in generations, the French people were being asked for their opinion, and the response was overwhelming. Hopes for reform soared. The Estates General finally convened at Versailles in May of 1789, but those high hopes were quickly dashed. A fundamental dispute over procedure brought everything to a halt. The issue was how the three estates would vote. Traditionally, they had voted by order, meaning each estate got a single vote. This was perfect for the clergy and the nobility, who could always join forces to outvote the Third Estate 2-1. The deputies of the Third Estate, however, arrived at Versailles with a radical demand. They wanted to vote by head, where each deputy would have one vote. Since they represented over 95% of the population, they had been granted as many deputies as the other two estates combined. Voting by head would give them a genuine chance to pass reforms. The king and the privileged orders refused to budge. The debate dragged on for weeks. Frustrated and feeling their moment slipping away, the deputies of the Third Estate decided to take matters into their own hands. On June 17, 1789, led by figures like the Abbé Sieyès, they made a revolutionary declaration. They proclaimed that they, and they alone, represented the true will of the French nation. They declared themselves the National Assembly. It was an audacious act of seizing sovereignty from the king. 3 days later, on June 20th, the deputies of the new National Assembly arrived at their meeting hall to find the doors locked and guarded by soldiers. Fearing the king was about to dissolve them, they moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. Standing together in that cavernous room, they swore a solemn oath, the famous tennis court oath. They pledged not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established. This was a moment of profound defiance. They were no longer just subjects of a king. They were citizens of a nation, determined to create a new political order. The final spark was now ready to be lit. King Louis XVI was trapped between the demands of his people and the pressures of his conservative court. He seemed to waver, at one point ordering the other two estates to join the National Assembly, giving the appearance of accepting the new reality. But at the same time, he committed a fatal error. He began to summon loyal army regiments, many composed of Swiss and German mercenaries, to positions surrounding Paris and Versailles. The people of Paris saw this troop build-up for what it was, the prelude to a military crackdown. The king was going to crush their assembly and restore his absolute power by force. Paranoia and fear gripped the city. Then, on the 11th of July, the king made his final catastrophic move. He dismissed his popular finance minister, Jacques Necker. Necker was a Swiss banker, and while no radical, he was seen by the public as a reformer, the one man in the government who understood their plight and was trying to help. His dismissal was interpreted as a clear signal that the hardliners at court had won. It was seen as the first step in an organized plot against the people. The news reached Paris on Sunday, July 12th, and the city erupted. In the gardens of the Palais Royal, a young journalist named Camille Desmoulins leaped onto a table, drew a pistol, and delivered a fiery speech to the panicked crowd. He cried that Necker's dismissal was the tocsin of a St. Bartholomew's massacre of patriots, deliberately invoking the memory of a brutal religious massacre from centuries past. He urged the people to take up arms in self-defense. The cry, "To arms! To arms!" echoed through the streets. The powder keg had been lit. The people of Paris, terrified of a royal assault and desperate to defend their fledgling revolution, now needed one thing above all else: weapons. Their frantic search for them over the next 48 hours would lead them directly to the gates of an old, hated fortress, the Bastille. Part 2. The Fortress and the Fury. Following the chaotic weekend of insurrection, the morning of Tuesday, July 14, 1789, dawned over a city that held its breath. Paris was not calm. It was coiled like a spring. The tocsin, the ancient alarm bell, rang out from church steeples, a frantic, clanging summons that cut through the humid summer air. It was a sound that meant fire, or invasion, or revolution. The makeshift citizen militia, which had been forming for the past 48 hours, was now a tangible force. But it was a body without a skeleton. It had passion and numbers, but it lacked weapons and, most critically, gunpowder. The urgent, all-consuming task of this day was to arm the revolution before the king's armies could arrive to strangle it in its cradle. This desperate search would first lead to a great victory, and then to a bloody and symbolic confrontation with the ghost of old France itself. The first objective was the Hôtel des Invalides. This was a magnificent and sprawling complex built by King Louis XIV as a home and hospital for aged and wounded soldiers. For the people of Paris, however, its importance lay in its basement. The cellars of the Invalides housed the city's largest armory, a vast repository of muskets and cannons. Before 9 o'clock in the morning, an immense crowd, some say numbering as many as 80,000 people, began to converge on the building. It was a human river flooding the streets, made up of shopkeepers, lawyers, artisans, laborers, and a significant number of women. The governor of the Invalides, a veteran officer named Victor de Bessenval, faced an impossible choice. He had only a small number of troops, many of whom were the elderly veterans the hospital was meant to serve. They were in no condition and had no desire to fire upon the citizens of Paris. As the crowd pressed at the gates, Bessenval hesitated, hoping for orders from Versailles that never came. The crowd grew bolder. They poured over the outer walls and across the dry moat. A small group smashed open the gates, and the river of people flooded into the main courtyard. They swarmed into the cellars, breaking down doors and overwhelming the few guards who stood in their way. What followed was a frantic and triumphant distribution of arms. Over the next hour, more than 30,000 muskets and 20 cannons were passed from hand to hand, held aloft, and carried out into the Paris sunshine. It was a staggering success, a near bloodless victory that armed the militia in a single stroke. Yet, as the initial euphoria subsided, a crucial and alarming realization spread through the crowd. The muskets were useless. They had been sabotaged. There were no firing mechanisms in many of them, and worse, there was no gunpowder. The governor had, with some foresight, moved the entire city's stock, some 24,000 pounds of black powder stored in barrels, to a more secure location a few days prior. He had sent it to the one place in Paris considered truly impregnable, the great medieval fortress that dominated the eastern skyline, the Bastille. And so, a new objective was set. The crowd, now heavily armed with silent muskets, began its slow, purposeful march across the city, from the Invalides in the west to the Bastille in the east. Their goal was simple: to demand the gunpowder that was rightfully theirs to defend their city. To the people of the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, the working-class district that lived in its shadow, the Bastille was more than just a building. It was a perpetual reminder of their own powerlessness. Its 8 circular towers, nearly 100 feet tall, connected by thick stone curtain walls, were a masterpiece of medieval military architecture, completely impervious to any form of mob violence. For 4 centuries, it had served as a state prison, a place of royal secrecy and arbitrary justice. Its very name was synonymous with the dreaded lettre de cachet, the sealed letter from the king that could make a person disappear from the world without charge, without trial, and without hope of release. Legends surrounded it. People spoke of dungeons below the water level of the Seine, of forgotten prisoners like the Man in the Iron Mask, and of unspeakable tortures in its depths. These stories, though wildly exaggerated by 1789, had created a powerful myth. The Bastille was the ultimate symbol of a king who could override all law, all rights, and all justice. It was the physical embodiment of tyranny. The governor of this fortress was Bernard René Jourdain de Launay. He was a man born inside the Bastille, as his father had been the previous governor. He was a nobleman by birth, and he had paid a large sum of money for his prestigious and usually quiet post. Now he found himself at the center of a revolutionary storm. His garrison was small, consisting of 82 invalides, veteran soldiers considered unfit for active duty, and 32 elite Swiss guards from the Salis Samade regiment, mercenaries hired by the king who were known for their professionalism and their absolute loyalty to their paymaster. In the days leading up to the 14th, Delaunay had made preparations. He had ordered the fortress's cannons, some mounted on the towers, to be loaded and aimed at the surrounding streets, a move that had terrified and enraged the local population. Sometime around 10:30 in the morning, the first wave of the crowd arrived at the outer gates. Their mood was demanding, but not yet violent. They sent a delegation to speak with the governor. Delaunay received them. The delegates, representing the new provisional city government at the Hôtel de Ville, made their case. The people were afraid, the cannons on the towers were an unacceptable menace, and the city's militia needed the gunpowder stored within the fortress. Delaunay, a man caught between his duty to the king and the terrifying reality of the mob outside, attempted to stall. He was polite, even welcoming. He assured the delegates he would not fire on the people unless attacked. He promised to pull the cannons back from the embrasures so they were no longer a visible threat. He even invited the delegates to stay for lunch, hoping that time, or the arrival of royal troops, would solve his problem. Outside, the crowd knew nothing of this polite negotiation. They saw their representatives enter the fortress and not return. The minutes stretched into hours. The crowd swelled, growing larger, denser, and more agitated. The air was thick with rumors that the delegates had been taken prisoner, that Delaunay was simply waiting for the right moment to massacre them all. By 1:30 in the afternoon, the collective patience of the crowd snapped. In a spontaneous act of daring, 2 men, a locksmith named Devan and a former soldier named Louis Tournay, climbed onto the roof of a perfumer's shop that was built against the Bastille's outer wall. From there, they managed to leap onto the wall itself and, using axes, hacked at the massive chains holding up the first drawbridge that spanned the moat to the undefended outer courtyard. With a great groan and a deafening crash, the bridge fell. The crowd roared. They interpreted the falling bridge as a signal of surrender from the governor. They surged forward, a human tidal wave flooding into the outer courtyard, believing the fortress was theirs. They found themselves in a confined space, trapped between the outer wall they had just crossed and the towering inner wall of the fortress proper, which was protected by another drawbridge and a massive wooden gate. And then, Governor Delaunay made the fatal decision of the day. Seeing the courtyard filled with what he perceived to be an attacking mob, he gave the order to fire. A volley of musket fire erupted from the soldiers stationed on the walls and in the towers. The crowd, packed tightly together and completely exposed, was decimated. Men fell screaming, their bodies torn apart by the gunfire. The triumphant roar of the mob turned into a collective shriek of horror and betrayal. They had been trapped and fired upon. All thoughts of negotiation vanished, replaced by a singular, burning desire for vengeance. The siege of the Bastille had begun. For the next 3 hours, a brutal and chaotic battle raged. The attackers were at a hopeless disadvantage. They were mostly artisans and shopkeepers who had never fired a weapon in their lives. They took cover where they could, behind overturned carts and in the doorways of nearby buildings, firing their uselessly underpowered muskets at the thick stone walls high above them. The fortress's defenders, protected behind battlements, could fire down on them with near total impunity. The cannons the crowd had dragged from the invalids were brought forward, but the amateur gunners struggled to aim them, and their cannonballs mostly bounced harmlessly off the ancient stones. The attackers suffered terribly. Nearly 100 were killed or wounded in the assault, while the garrison suffered only a single casualty. Inside, the veteran invalids were losing their nerve. These were old soldiers. They pleaded with Delaunay to surrender. But the governor, perhaps fearing the retribution of the mob, or perhaps still clinging to a sliver of hope that reinforcements would arrive, refused. The battle seemed destined to end in a bloody defeat for the revolution. Then, around 3:30 in the afternoon, everything changed. A new sound was heard above the din of the muskets, the rhythmic tramp of marching soldiers and the rumble of heavy wheels on cobblestones. A detachment of the Gardes Françaises, the French Guards, had arrived. This was an elite infantry regiment of the Royal Army, but its soldiers had been living and fraternizing with the people of Paris for years. They were sympathetic to the revolution, and earlier in the week they had pledged not to act against the citizens. Now, led by professional officers like Pierre-Augustin Hulin and Jacob Job Elie, they were going a step further. They were joining the revolution. Their arrival was the decisive moment. They were a disciplined military unit. They brought with them 5 heavy cannons seized from the invalids, and more importantly, they brought the expertise to use them effectively. They marched into the outer courtyard, taking command of the chaotic battle. They pushed back the civilian attackers, clearing a field of fire, and aimed their cannons directly at the main gate and the chains of the inner drawbridge. This was a threat the medieval fortress was not designed to withstand. Delaunay, watching from the battlements, knew the end had come. His walls could not survive a direct, point-blank artillery bombardment. He made one last, desperate gambit. He scribbled a note threatening to light the 24,000 pounds of gunpowder in the fortress's cellars. He would blow up the Bastille and the entire Faubourg Saint-Antoine with it, unless the attackers allowed his garrison to surrender and march out with the full honors of war. The note was passed through a small hole in the gate. The revolutionary leaders, Hulin and Elie, read it and refused. They would accept nothing but an unconditional surrender. Inside, Delaunay's own men took matters into their own hands. They would not allow their governor to commit a suicidal act of mass murder. They physically stopped him from going to the powder magazines and forced him to surrender. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, a white handkerchief appeared, waved through an opening in the gate. The firing ceased. The inner drawbridge was slowly lowered. The battle was over. The crowd poured into the heart of the fortress, a place of legend and fear now breached. They disarmed the soldiers of the garrison, some of whom were embraced as brothers, while the Swiss guards, as foreign mercenaries, were treated with more suspicion. They found and freed the 7 prisoners. But the mob's thirst for vengeance had not been quenched by victory. Governor Delaunay was identified and seized. He was promised protection and was led away, destined for a trial at the Hôtel de Ville. But the crowd that escorted him was a vortex of fury. He was beaten, spat upon, and stabbed along the way. As he stumbled near the city hall, he was said to have kicked a man in the groin and cried out, "Let me die!" The mob obliged. He was overwhelmed, stabbed to death with swords and bayonets, and his head was crudely sawn off with a pocket knife. It was then mounted on a pike and paraded through the streets of Paris, a gruesome trophy of the people's rage. The storming of the Bastille was complete, and its bloody aftermath was a clear and terrifying sign of the raw, violent power that the revolution had now unleashed. Part 3. The Aftermath and the Legacy. As the sun set on Paris on July 14, 1789, the city was a chaotic scene of celebration and brutal retribution. The 7 prisoners found inside the fortress were paraded through the streets as living symbols of liberated innocence. More gruesomely, the heads of Governor de Launay and the city's chief magistrate, Jacques de Flesselles, who was accused of misleading the people about the location of weapons, were mounted on pikes and carried aloft by the triumphant crowd. This visceral act was a shocking and unambiguous message. The old rules were gone. The people, not the king, were now the arbiters of justice. The fall of a stone fortress was one thing. The public execution of royal officials by a mob was something else entirely. It signaled that the revolution had crossed a bloody and irreversible threshold. Some 12 miles away, in the opulent and insulated world of the Palace of Versailles, King Louis XVI was completely unaware of the day's earth-shattering events. He had spent the day hunting, and that evening, in his personal diary, he made a single, now famously ironic entry for July 14th. Rien. Nothing. It meant nothing had happened on his hunt. Later that night, he was woken by the Duc de la Rochefoucauld-Liancourt, who had galloped from Paris with the news. The king, still groggy, asked the question that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. "Is it a revolt?" he asked. The Duke's reply has echoed through history. "No, sire. It is a revolution." In that moment, the entire political landscape of France shifted. The king realized he had completely lost control of his capital. The foreign regiments stationed around Paris, whose presence had so terrified the populace, either began to withdraw or, in the case of the French Guards, had actively joined the rebellion. The planned military crackdown on the National Assembly was now impossible. The king's authority had evaporated in a single afternoon. For 2 days, he vacillated, but the reality of his position was undeniable. He had no choice but to capitulate. On July 17th, 3 days after the Bastille's fall, King Louis XVI made a humiliating journey from Versailles into Paris. He travelled with no royal pomp in a simple carriage, escorted by members of the National Assembly and the newly formed citizen militia. The streets, which would have once cheered his arrival, were now lined with armed citizens, many holding the muskets they had seized from the Invalides. It was a tense and silent procession. Arriving at the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, he was met by the new revolutionary mayor, Jean-Sylvain Bailly. There, in a moment of profound symbolic importance, the king was presented with a tricolour cockade. This was the new emblem of the revolution, combining the blue and red colours of Paris with the white of the Bourbon monarchy. As the king pinned the cockade to his hat, the crowd, which had been silent and menacing, finally erupted into cheers of "Vive le Roi" or "Long live the king." But the meaning had changed. He was no longer the king by divine right, an absolute ruler. He was, now, in the eyes of the people, their king, a monarch whose legitimacy was conditional on his acceptance of the revolution. The immediate political consequence of this royal capitulation was the salvation of the National Assembly. Before the 14th of July, the deputies of Versailles were in a precarious position, facing the imminent threat of being disbanded by force. The fall of the Bastille ended that threat permanently. It was a popular insurrection that validated their political rebellion. The event emboldened the Assembly, giving it the confidence and the political space to press forward with its radical agenda of drafting a new constitution. Power had decisively shifted from the king's court to the people's elected representatives. The people of Paris had, in effect, become the armed guardians of their new government. The news of the victory in Paris spread across the French countryside with incredible speed, carried by travelers and official dispatches. For the millions of peasants still living under the thumb of feudal lords, the news was an inspiration and a trigger. But it also ignited a strange and powerful wave of collective panic that became known as the Great Fear. Wild rumors flew from village to village. It was said that vengeful aristocrats, furious about the events in Paris, were hiring bands of brigands to roam the countryside, burning crops and massacring peasants to punish them. This paranoia, born from generations of oppression, sparked a massive rural uprising. Peasants took up arms against the symbols of their servitude. They marched on the chateau of their local lords, they broke into the manor houses and demanded the feudal charters, the centuries-old legal documents that listed their endless obligations, their dues, their taxes, and their unpaid labor. They burned these documents in massive bonfires in the castle courtyards. In some cases, where lords resisted, the chateaux themselves were burned to the ground. This was the Great Fear, a nationwide peasant rebellion that, in the space of a few weeks, effectively dismantled the feudal system from the ground up, long before the politicians in Versailles could pass a law to do so. This combination of the urban uprising in Paris and the rural rebellion across the country created an unstoppable momentum for radical change. On the night of August 4th, 1789, in a dramatic session that lasted until 2 a.m, the National Assembly formally abolished the feudal system. Noble deputies, caught up in a wave of patriotic fervor and recognizing the futility of resistance, rose one by one to renounce their ancient privileges, their hunting rights, their manorial courts, their tax exemptions. It was a stunning and almost bloodless end to a system that had defined French life for 1,000 years. With the old order swept away, the Assembly turned to creating a new one. On August 26, they produced one of the most important documents in modern history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Deeply influenced by the ideas of the Enlightenment and the American Declaration of Independence, this document laid out the core principles of the new French society. It declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. It enshrined the principles of liberty, property, security, and the right to resist oppression. It called for freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and a system where all citizens were equal before the law. The Declaration was a direct refutation of everything the Bastille had represented. The fortress had stood for arbitrary power, secret justice, and inherited privilege. The Declaration stood for individual liberty, public law, and natural rights. The demolition of the physical Bastille began almost as soon as it had fallen. The new city government ordered the fortress to be dismantled, brick by brick. A shrewd entrepreneur named Pierre-François Palloy won the contract and turned the demolition into a masterclass of revolutionary propaganda. He hired over 800 workers, transforming the site into a massive open-air workshop. He sold souvenirs made from the fortress's stones and ironwork inkwells, paperweights, and snuff boxes. He had medals forged from the prisoners' chains. Most effectively, he carved 83 models of the Bastille from its own stones and sent one to each of the 83 new départements, or administrative regions, of France. These models served as powerful relics, spreading the message of the revolution and the fall of tyranny to every corner of the kingdom. The site itself was cleared, creating an open space where a symbol of oppression had once stood. The message was clear: tyranny had been torn down to make way for freedom. Over the next 2 centuries, the legacy of that day would continue to evolve. The French Revolution itself would descend into more radical and violent phases, including the Reign of Terror, and would ultimately lead to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. But the memory of July 14th endured. In 1880, the French Third Republic declared July 14th to be the national holiday of France, la fête nationale. Known in the English-speaking world as Bastille Day, it is a day of massive military parades, fireworks, and public celebrations. In the end, the story of the Bastille is the story of a symbol. By 1789, the fortress was of little military importance and held only a handful of prisoners. Its destruction did not defeat the king's army or topple his government in a single day. However, it shattered the illusion of royal invincibility. It proved to the people of France that even the most formidable symbols of oppression could be brought crashing down by the collective will of ordinary citizens. This podcast was entirely produced by Andrew Scott. If you have any suggestions for topics or improvements, please get in contact.